The wedding day. The evening unfolded like a dream, with the soft hum of conversation filling the air, the delicate rustling of leaves overhead, and the shimmer of fairy lights twinkling like stars in the early evening sky. The golden rays of the setting sun cast a serene light over the backyard, illuminating every perfect detail that had been carefully planned for months. It was a place of love, celebration, and joy. The warm breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers and the laughter of friends and family. Abigail and Marcus's wedding day had arrived, and it was nothing short of magical. The backyard of their elegant home had been transformed into a haven. Long, lush tables draped in white linen were scattered with carefully arranged centerpieces of roses, lilies, and ivy, each symbolizing the couple's shared growth and commitment. Lanterns were hung in clusters between the trees, creating a soft, ethereal glow, while the soft tinkling of a piano in the distance set the tone for the evening. It felt like a scene from a fairy tale, but this was their reality, a celebration of love and union. Abigail, radiant in her wedding gown, stood at the center of it all, glowing not only in the golden light of the evening but in the pure love that surrounded her. The dress, a classic A-line with intricate lacework along the bodice and a flowing skirt, was a perfect reflection of her grace. She stood tall and poised, her hair styled elegantly, curls cascading around her face. Her smile was the brightest feature of all, and in her eyes, there was a sparkle of excitement, pride, and peace. This was her moment, a culmination of years of dedication, hard work, and the unwavering belief that love, no matter the obstacles, could create something truly beautiful. Next to her was Marcus, a man who had grown into his role as not only her partner but also her equal. The tall, broad-shouldered figure beside her looked effortlessly dashing in his tailored tuxedo. His deep brown eyes, full of admiration and devotion, never strayed far from Abigail. His presence was solid, comforting, and steady. Despite the suits, the formalities, and the grand occasion, he stood there with only one thing on his mind, her. They had met years before, on a case that had initially been nothing more than a professional interaction. However, somewhere along the way, their mutual respect and shared ideals had grown into something deeper, something undeniable. Together, they were a team, strong, capable, and now, united in this special moment. Every guest who had gathered for the celebration could see the bond between them. Their love wasn't just in their words or shared glances, it was in every gesture, every small movement, and every laugh that escaped them. They had been through ups and downs, but this day was a celebration of how far they had come and how far they were willing to go for one another. Abigail's parents, proud beyond words, were in the crowd, watching with tear-filled eyes. They had always known their daughter was exceptional, her drive, her intellect, and her unshakable sense of right and wrong. They had supported her every step of the way, and now, as she stood before them as a bride, they couldn't help but marvel at the woman she had become. They spoke with guests, telling stories of Abigail's childhood, of how she had always been the one to stand up for others, to fight for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. "Do you remember when she was a teenager?" her father said to a group of friends. "She wouldn't back down from an argument, even when it was with me. She's always been strong-willed." He laughed heartily, a proud smile on his face. "But I always knew she'd grow into someone who would change the world." Nearby, Marcus's family, equally joyful, mingled with their guests. Marcus had been raised in a household that valued discipline, respect, and hard work. His parents beamed with pride as they watched their son marry the woman of his dreams. They couldn't have asked for a better match for their son. To them, Abigail wasn't just a judge or an accomplished professional, she was the woman who completed their son's life, who brought out the best in him. Together, they made an indomitable pair. The atmosphere was filled with laughter, music, and joy as guests drifted between tables, enjoying the food, the wine, and the stories shared. Some whispered excitedly about the couple's rise to success, others reminisced about the old days when Marcus and Abigail were just starting out. But one thing was certain, Everyone present knew that Abigail and Marcus were exceptional people, not just because of their careers or accomplishments, but because of who they were at their core: kind, giving, and utterly devoted to each other. Abigail and Marcus had chosen to host their wedding at their home because it symbolized everything they had built together: years of dedication, love, and shared dreams. Their home wasn't just a structure, it was the place where they had begun to envision a future as a couple, where they had faced challenges together, and where they had built their lives. They had worked hard to create the perfect setting for their day. Marcus had personally overseen the landscaping of the yard, making sure everything was just right. He had a hand in every detail, from the arrangement of the flowers to the placement of the tables, ensuring that the environment reflected the love and care they had put into their relationship. Abigail, meanwhile, had planned every aspect of the ceremony, down to the music, the speeches, and even the vows. She had always been meticulous, but this was more than a celebration of their love, it was a reflection of their shared values, their belief in family, community, and justice. As the evening wore on, Abigail and Marcus moved through the crowd, greeting friends, laughing, and savoring the moments of their wedding day. Their wedding was more than a celebration of their love, it was a symbol of their commitment to one another, to their families, and to the lives they had built together. Every smile, every touch, every moment was a testament to the depth of their bond. And yet, amid all the joy and celebration, a storm was brewing. A storm that neither Abigail nor Marcus could have anticipated. They had carefully crafted the perfect evening, but the shadow of intolerance was lurking just beyond the warm glow of their celebration. It was Eleanor. Eleanor had lived in the neighborhood for nearly a decade, and while she had always maintained a polite distance from Abigail and Marcus, it was clear that she wasn't fond of them. She had never voiced her feelings, but her disapproving glances, her cold interactions at neighborhood gatherings, and her subtle remarks about the changing demographic of the neighborhood said more than enough. For Eleanor, the sight of so many guests from various racial and cultural backgrounds, people who didn't quite fit her image of the perfect neighborhood, was unsettling. From the edge of her own yard, Eleanor watched as the celebration unfolded. The laughter, the voices of people from all walks of life, the cheerful mingling of cultures and backgrounds, it all seemed like a threat to her vision of what the neighborhood should be. As she stood there, her gaze hardened. She couldn't understand it. In her mind, this was wrong. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Eleanor crossed her arms over her chest as she surveyed the scene, bitterness creeping into her thoughts. She couldn't bear the idea of the wedding continuing without someone stepping in to set things right. With a sudden, cold resolve, she pulled out her phone and dialed the local police. "I'm calling to report a disturbance," she said sharply. "There's an unauthorized event happening next door. They've got too many people, and I'm not sure who most of them are. It's suspicious, and frankly, it doesn't look right." Her words were laced with disdain, and as she hung up, a sense of satisfaction washed over her. She had done her part to restore the order she thought had been disrupted. But what she didn't realize was that the order she sought wasn't just about following rules, it was about her own prejudices, her own narrow vision of the world. The police were on their way. And Abigail and Marcus, in the midst of their most beautiful day, had no idea that a storm was about to break over their wedding, threatening to shatter the joy they had so carefully built. The police arrive. The evening's tranquility shattered as the distant sound of sirens grew louder, a stark contrast to the peaceful hum of the celebration. At first, it was faint, almost unnoticeable over the soft music playing in the background and the light conversations taking place. But then the shrill sound of the sirens pierced the air, growing steadily louder and closer. Abigail and Marcus both turned toward the street, confused at the unexpected intrusion into their joyful day. "Do you think they're here for a neighbor's noise complaint?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with a hint of curiosity but also concern. They had worked so hard to make this day perfect, and the last thing they expected was any sort of disruption. Abigail, however, had a feeling, something told her that this was no ordinary situation. As the police cars appeared at the end of the street, the flashing red and blue lights painted the evening in a harsh, unsettling glow. Abigail's stomach tightened. The sirens, the lights, and the presence of law enforcement were out of place here, in what should have been a joyous, private celebration of love and union. But as the officers' vehicles came to a stop at the edge of their driveway, she felt a sudden wave of unease. "I'll go check," Marcus said, his voice calm but with a seriousness that Abigail immediately recognized. He had always been the steady one, the one who didn't let his emotions override his actions. He trusted his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him that something wasn't right. He made his way toward the officers, trying to assess the situation before it escalated. Abigail watched him go, her heart pounding as she tried to process the intrusion. As Marcus approached, he was met by two officers, both of whom looked rigid and unwelcoming. The lead officer, a tall man with a broad, muscular build and a stern expression, stepped forward, while his partner, a younger officer with a sharp gaze, remained a few steps behind. "Good evening, officers," Marcus began, his tone measured but firm. "Is there a problem? We're hosting a private event here tonight." The lead officer gave Marcus a cursory glance before speaking. "We've received a complaint about a large gathering here. We're just doing our job, need to make sure everything is in order." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his confusion apparent. "A complaint? About a wedding? We've been planning this for months. There's nothing wrong here." The officer didn't seem to acknowledge the legitimacy of Marcus's words. Instead, his expression remained neutral, even cold. "We need to verify the event," he said shortly. "Please step aside and allow us to do our job." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to keep the situation from escalating. As an FBI agent, he was used to confrontations, but he knew the importance of diffusing tension when possible. "There's no need for any checks. Everything here is completely legal," he said, standing his ground. "You don't need to disturb my guests." Abigail, still standing near the gathering, watched as Marcus tried to reason with the officers. He spoke with authority, but there was a level of unease in his posture. He could sense that the situation wasn't going to be resolved with a simple conversation. His instincts told him that this wasn't just about a noise complaint or a wedding guest list, it was something more. As he turned back to address the officers, he could see their bodies stiffen, their attention shifting from him to the people in the backyard. The guests had begun to notice the commotion, and whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. Abigail felt the tension rising in the air, a tangible weight that made it difficult to breathe. The officers' presence was imposing, and the way they scrutinized the scene made it feel as though they were looking for something to criticize. "Is there a problem, officer?" Abigail called out, her voice calm but edged with a steely resolve. The lead officer turned toward her, his eyes narrowing when he saw her for the first time. "We're just making sure everything is in order, ma'am. There's been a complaint, and we need to conduct an inspection." Abigail's heart skipped a beat. She had recognized the way the officer spoke to her. It wasn't just an innocent inquiry, but a directive that carried an edge of authority and suspicion. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Why had the officers arrived without any prior notice? Why had they responded so quickly to a complaint from someone they didn't even know? "I understand," Abigail said, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "But I assure you, we have every right to be here, and we're hosting a private event. If you have any concerns, I'm happy to provide whatever documentation or information you need." At this point, Marcus stepped forward, clearly aware that things were escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. "There's no need for this. We're not causing any disturbances. There's no reason to treat us like criminals." His voice was authoritative, yet there was an undercurrent of tension in his words that made it clear he was no longer sure how to de-escalate the situation. The officer seemed to ignore Marcus's plea, his gaze flickering toward the guests standing nervously behind Abigail and Marcus. His eyes scanned the crowd, lingering on certain individuals for longer than was necessary. "We need to see everyone's identification," the officer said curtly. "We need to verify that all of your guests are accounted for and that this gathering is above board." Abigail's face hardened. "That's not how things work here. This is a private event. You don't have the right to interrogate our guests like this." The officer's eyes met hers with a hard glare. "If you don't comply, we'll be forced to take further action. Step aside, ma'am." The command in his tone sent a ripple of unease through the crowd, and Abigail could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. It was becoming clear that these officers weren't interested in listening or understanding. Their attitudes were dismissive, their eyes filled with an unsettling combination of suspicion and authority. It was as though they had already made up their minds about what was happening here. And then, with a swift motion, the officer grabbed Marcus by the arm. "You're coming with us," he ordered, his grip tightening. Abigail's eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing?" she cried out, rushing forward, her voice sharp and filled with panic. "You can't just arrest him. He hasn't done anything wrong." The officer ignored her protest, his eyes flickering with a mix of irritation and indifference. "We have reason to believe that this gathering is unauthorized, and we're taking him in for questioning." In that moment, the world seemed to slow down. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. Her husband, her partner, the man she had chosen to spend her life with, was being treated like a criminal in front of their guests, in front of their family, on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. Marcus, though surprised by the sudden escalation, remained composed. "I'm not going anywhere until you explain why you're doing this," he said, his voice cold but steady. He was an FBI agent, accustomed to difficult situations, but this felt different. His gut told him that the officers weren't simply enforcing the law, they were targeting him. The officer tightened his grip on Marcus's arm. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're coming with us." Abigail's heart sank as she watched Marcus being dragged toward the patrol car. She could hear the murmurs of shock and disbelief ripple through the crowd. People were whispering to one another, trying to make sense of what was happening. Some of them, already uncomfortable with the heavy-handedness of the officers, began to stand up, their eyes wide with concern. It was clear that this wasn't just about a wedding, this was about something deeper, something more insidious. The officers were not acting out of a sense of duty to protect the community, but out of suspicion and prejudice. Abigail could see it in their eyes as they grabbed Marcus. There was something more at play here than a simple misunderstanding. As Marcus was roughly pushed into the back of the patrol car, Abigail stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The police, the ones who were supposed to protect and serve, had turned their attention on her husband, without cause, without reason. And for what? Because of who they were. Because of the way they lived their lives, because of the people they had chosen to surround themselves with. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to let this stand. Not on her wedding day. Not ever. She turned to face the officer in charge. "You've made a huge mistake," she said, her voice cold, sharp. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." But the officer didn't respond. Instead, he simply walked away, leaving Abigail standing in the growing silence of the backyard, her heart pounding with the knowledge that this battle was far from over. And as the police car pulled away, Abigail knew that this wedding, her wedding, had just become the beginning of a fight for justice that would change everything. The identity reveal. The cold, metallic sound of the police car door slamming shut echoed through the backyard, sending a shiver down Abigail's spine. Her heart was racing as she watched the car pull away, its sirens now silent but the memory of the scene replaying in her mind like a cruel loop. Marcus was inside that vehicle. Her husband. The love of her life. Taken away from her without explanation, without a shred of justice. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The twinkling lights above the yard, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, it all felt so distant, so irrelevant, in the face of what had just happened. Abigail stood motionless, her chest tight, her thoughts spinning out of control. Her guests, too, were still, the shock of the situation settling over the entire gathering. Some were staring in disbelief, while others were muttering among themselves, unsure of how to react. Abigail's gaze was locked on the police car, which was disappearing down the street. She couldn't fathom it. She couldn't understand how something so senseless could happen. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she wasn't going to let this stand. This wasn't just a wedding, it wasn't just a simple misunderstanding, it was a blatant injustice, and Abigail Harper wasn't someone who let injustice go unchecked. Taking a deep breath, Abigail turned toward her parents, who were standing near the edge of the crowd. The look in their eyes mirrored her own shock and confusion, but there was something else there, too. A quiet strength. Her mother stepped forward first, placing a comforting hand on Abigail's arm. "We'll make this right," her mother said softly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the concern she was trying to mask. "We'll get Marcus back." Abigail nodded, grateful for her mother's reassurance, but she felt the weight of the moment pressing on her. Her mind was already running through a million possible scenarios. As a judge, she had dealt with law enforcement countless times, she knew how the system worked. She had seen the good and the bad, and right now, she knew this wasn't just a case of a mistake or a misunderstanding. The way Marcus had been treated, roughly, without explanation, without any clear justification, was something deeper. Something more insidious. One of their closest friends, Michael, a lawyer with a sharp mind and a deep sense of justice, approached Abigail, his face grim. He had been standing off to the side, watching the situation unfold with a growing sense of unease. Michael was well versed in the law, and he had seen his fair share of abuses. But what had just transpired here was something entirely different. "Abigail," Michael began, his voice low, "I've seen enough to know this isn't about a noise complaint. The way they treated Marcus, without any real cause, without even trying to understand the situation, that's not a mistake. It's targeted. You know that, right?" Abigail's throat tightened. She had been so caught up in the raw emotion of the moment that she hadn't allowed herself the space to fully process the implications of what had happened. But Michael was right. This wasn't a random event. This wasn't just bad police work, it was something else. And it made her blood boil. "I know," Abigail replied, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and determination. This was no accident. They knew exactly who Marcus was. They knew exactly who we are. And yet, they still treated him like a criminal. The weight of her words settled over them all, the truth of the situation sinking in. But Michael wasn't finished. He looked Abigail squarely in the eyes, his gaze steady and serious. "You're a judge," he said softly. "You've built your career on fighting for justice, for fairness. Don't let this go. We can't let this go." Abigail's lips pressed into a firm line as the weight of his words sank in. She had spent her entire life fighting for what was right, for justice, for everyone. But now, it wasn't just a matter of upholding the law. It was about her own fight. Her fight to protect the person she loved, to make sure that what had just happened didn't go unchallenged. The officers had taken Marcus without cause, without so much as a shred of evidence. They had crossed a line, and Abigail wasn't going to let them get away with it. "We need to get him back," she said firmly. "And we need to make sure this never happens again. This isn't just about Marcus, it's about everyone who's been targeted simply because of who they are." The words were like a fire lit inside her, and she could feel the heat of determination spreading through her chest. She wasn't going to allow herself to be a passive victim of circumstance. No. Abigail Harper was a fighter, and this fight was just beginning. The following hours were a blur. Abigail and Michael worked tirelessly, contacting every possible connection they had, lawyers, friends in law enforcement, anyone who could help get to the bottom of the situation. As they waited for word on Marcus's whereabouts, Abigail took to social media, posting a statement about the injustice that had taken place in her own backyard. Her words, clear and resolute, began to spread like wildfire. The power of her position as a judge, her reputation as someone who stood for justice, gave her message an immediate impact. Soon, the local news stations picked up the story, and the outpouring of support was overwhelming. People from all walks of life shared her post, angry at the injustice that had taken place and rallying behind the call for answers. But as the hours stretched on and the phone calls kept pouring in, Abigail's mind began to race. She knew that this wasn't just a random act of brutality, it had been orchestrated. Eleanor's phone call to the police, the way the officers had responded with such force, without any understanding of the situation, it all pointed to one thing. Someone had decided that Marcus and Abigail didn't belong in this neighborhood, and they were willing to do whatever it took to drive them out. Abigail's anger burned as she thought about Eleanor, the woman who had never once tried to get to know her or Marcus, who had always kept her distance with her cold, judgmental stares. Abigail knew that Eleanor had a history of making passive-aggressive comments about their presence in the neighborhood, but until now, it hadn't seemed like more than a vague discomfort. But now, in the wake of the officers' actions, Abigail realized that those comments weren't just idle musings. They had been a manifestation of something darker. Eleanor's beliefs, her biases, had driven her to take drastic action, and she had used the power of law enforcement to carry out her personal agenda. It wasn't just about race, it was about power. And Abigail wasn't going to let it stand. The phone call came in the early hours of the morning. Marcus was being released. But the officer on the other end of the line wasn't offering an apology. No, he was merely offering an explanation, a half-hearted one, at best. "We're sorry for the confusion," the officer said. "There was an issue with the guest list. We had to verify some things. But he's free to go now. You can pick him up." Abigail's breath caught in her throat as she heard the words, but she wasn't about to let the conversation end there. "Confusion?" she repeated, her voice icy. "You didn't need to check the guest list. You didn't need to arrest my husband. You didn't need to do anything but show respect. And yet, you chose to treat him like a criminal." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before the officer spoke again. "Look, ma'am, we're sorry. We acted on a complaint. We weren't sure what we were walking into." Abigail's patience snapped. "You didn't care to check. You didn't care to know who you were dealing with. You acted out of ignorance. And now, I expect accountability." The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but Abigail wasn't done. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed. This wasn't a simple mistake. This was a clear example of prejudice, and I won't let it slide." The line went silent for a moment, and Abigail knew that this was just the beginning. Her fight for justice had only just begun, and she wasn't about to back down. When she arrived at the station, Marcus was waiting for her, his hands still slightly red from the handcuffs, but his expression was calm, even though his eyes betrayed the weariness of the ordeal. The moment he saw her, a small smile appeared on his face, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Abigail rushed toward him, pulling him into a tight embrace. The world around them faded as they held each other, the weight of the night's events still fresh but beginning to feel more like a distant memory with each passing moment. But Abigail knew this wasn't over. No, this was only the beginning. She was going to hold those responsible accountable, and she was going to make sure that this never happened again, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had been unjustly targeted. And as they stood together in that moment, their bond stronger than ever, Abigail Harper knew that her fight was only beginning. The fallout. The silence in the police station felt suffocating as Abigail and Marcus made their way out of the building, the weight of the night's events hanging heavily between them. The cool air outside hit Abigail like a wave, sharp and refreshing, but it didn't ease the tension in her chest. Marcus, walking beside her, seemed to carry the same burden, the exhaustion evident in his steps, though his posture remained straight and resolute. They had been through a lot that night, but neither one of them had given in to the storm that had threatened to overtake their lives. Once they reached their car, Marcus let out a long, steadying breath and finally turned to face Abigail. "I can't believe that just happened," he said, the words almost coming out in disbelief, as though he was still processing the events. "It doesn't make sense. How did we get here? How did a peaceful wedding turn into that?" Abigail didn't have an answer, at least not one that made sense. "I don't know. But I won't let it go, Marcus. We can't let it go. What happened to you, to us, it's not just about us anymore. This is bigger than a simple mistake or misunderstanding. This was about something much darker." Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched, his mind clearly still trying to absorb the situation. "I don't even know where to start. I've worked my whole life to protect people, to uphold the law, and yet here I am, being treated like a criminal in my own neighborhood. They didn't care who I was. They didn't care what I've done, what I stand for. They just saw a target." Abigail's heart ached as she looked at her husband. He had spent years fighting to keep people safe, to serve and protect, and yet in a single moment, he had become a victim of something far more insidious. The officers hadn't seen him for who he was, a man of integrity and service. They had only seen the color of his skin and made assumptions about him. "It wasn't just about you, Marcus," Abigail said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "It was about us. About what we represent. Our love, our marriage, our life. It's a threat to their narrow view of the world. And it's not just about you or me. It's about every single person who's been unjustly targeted, who's been made to feel less than." Marcus reached out and took her hand in his grip firm and comforting. "We'll make them understand. We'll expose this. We won't let it go." As they sat in the car, staring out at the dark street, Abigail's mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. The social media post she had written earlier had already gained traction. News outlets had picked up the story, and by the time they had left the station, her inbox was flooded with messages of support, messages of outrage. People were angry, and they were rallying behind her and Marcus. But it wasn't just about public opinion. It was about taking action, real, meaningful action to ensure that this didn't happen again. The next day, Abigail woke early, her mind already working through the steps she needed to take. The media had been relentless in its coverage of the incident, and the story had sparked heated conversations all across the city. News anchors were calling it an act of police brutality, while social media had exploded with people sharing their own stories of discrimination and injustice. Abigail knew that this was just the beginning, but the spotlight on her and Marcus also brought a new level of scrutiny, one that she hadn't expected. Abigail and Marcus decided to go public with their story in a more formal way. They contacted their lawyer, Michael, and began preparing a statement that would put the full weight of the law behind their fight for justice. They would press charges, not only against the officers involved but also against the police department for its systemic failures. It wasn't just about Marcus's wrongful arrest, it was about holding the system accountable for perpetuating racial biases that led to incidents like this in the first place. As they prepared for the next steps, Abigail couldn't help but feel the heavy responsibility of what lay ahead. This wasn't just a fight for justice for Marcus, it was a fight for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for anyone who had ever been subjected to the kind of discrimination that they had faced. It was about something much bigger than themselves. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings, public statements, and media interviews. Abigail's resolve only grew stronger with each passing day. The story of what had happened at their wedding became a rallying cry for people across the nation. Celebrities, activists, and ordinary citizens shared their support for Abigail and Marcus, calling for accountability and justice. But not everyone was on their side. As Abigail's name became more well-known, the backlash began to grow. There were those who believed the officers had acted in good faith, that the couple's actions had somehow provoked the response. Some called for Abigail to apologize, claiming that the situation had been blown out of proportion. The trolls online had plenty to say, accusing her of playing the race card and suggesting that she was using her platform to disrupt the peaceful community. But Abigail refused to be swayed. She knew that the public's opinion, while important, wasn't the final measure of what was right. It was the law, and she was willing to take this fight to the highest court if necessary. In the midst of the legal battles, the true depth of the corruption within the police department began to surface. Investigations revealed that the officers involved in Marcus's arrest had been involved in similar incidents before, acts of racial profiling, excessive force, and other abuses of power. This was no isolated incident. It was part of a larger, deeply ingrained problem that needed to be addressed. The discovery of these past actions caused an uproar in the community. Activists and civil rights organizations rallied around the couple, demanding that the police officers be held accountable for their actions. But the fight wasn't over yet. The officers involved were still on paid leave, and the police chief, who had initially downplayed the situation, was refusing to take full responsibility. Abigail knew that this battle would be long and difficult, but she also knew that they were on the right side of history. Every day, more people began to understand the gravity of what had happened. They saw that it wasn't just about Marcus's arrest, it was about the systemic racism that plagued not only the police department but also many institutions across the country. One evening, a breakthrough came. After weeks of negotiations, the police department finally agreed to a meeting with Abigail and her legal team. It was clear that they had felt the pressure mounting, the public outcry becoming too loud to ignore. The officers involved in Marcus's arrest had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, and the police chief was ready to meet face-to-face to address the situation. Abigail arrived at the meeting with Michael, her lawyer, and several other key figures in the legal community. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. On the other side of the table sat the police chief, along with several senior officers. They looked uncomfortable, but they maintained their formal postures, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. The chief cleared his throat and spoke first, his voice measured but cautious. "We understand the gravity of the situation, Judge Harper. We've conducted an internal review, and while we stand by our officers' actions, we are committed to addressing any potential flaws in our training or protocol. We take your concerns seriously." Abigail's eyes narrowed as she stared at the chief. "You take my concerns seriously now," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "What about when you allowed those officers to treat my husband like a criminal without cause? What about when they racially profiled him based on nothing but their own assumptions?" The chief shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't respond right away. Abigail continued, her voice growing more passionate. "This isn't about one isolated incident. This is about a culture of prejudice and power that runs deep within your department. This is about holding those who abuse their authority accountable. Not making excuses." The room was quiet for a long moment before the chief spoke again. "We are committed to reform. We are committed to making sure something like this doesn't happen again." Abigail leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his. "Your department has a long history of similar incidents. If you truly want to make things right, it's not just about a few bad officers. It's about changing the entire culture. It's about making sure that people are treated with dignity and respect, no matter their race, no matter who they are. And that begins with accountability." The silence in the room was palpable. Finally, the chief spoke again, his voice quieter this time. We will do everything we can to make things right. We'll work with you and the community to bring about change." Abigail nodded, her resolve as strong as ever. "I'll believe it when I see it. But I won't stop until the changes you promise are actually made." It wasn't a victory, at least not yet. But it was a step forward. The battle for justice was far from over, but Abigail and Marcus knew they were no longer fighting alone. The fight for justice had become their life's work. And this was just the beginning. The tide turns. The weeks following the police department's reluctant meeting were a whirlwind of legal motions, public rallies, and heated discussions in every corner of the city. Abigail had never imagined that her wedding day, the one she had planned for years with such care, would become a symbol of something much larger, much more significant than her love for Marcus. But that's what it had become, an embodiment of systemic issues, a catalyst for change, and a loud call for justice. Her public statements, supported by Marcus and the growing momentum of their cause, had sparked a citywide conversation about racial profiling, police brutality, and the broader conversation surrounding inequality in law enforcement. It wasn't just about them anymore, it was about every person who had ever been unfairly targeted by those meant to protect and serve. Abigail knew that her voice, her influence as a judge, and the widespread attention their story had garnered were powerful tools, but she also understood the immense responsibility that came with them. Every word, every action, would be scrutinized, and she couldn't afford to falter. As the media continued to cover the fallout, Abigail found herself attending press conferences, community meetings, and speaking engagements, sometimes not even sure if she had the energy to do one more. Her days were long, and the emotional toll of everything she was juggling took a toll on her personal life as well. But through it all, Marcus remained by her side, steady and unwavering, offering her the support she needed. His unshakable belief in their cause and the clarity he found in his own resolve helped keep her grounded, even when everything seemed like it was falling apart. The first major breakthrough came when Abigail and Michael, her lawyer, were able to secure an independent review of the police department's practices. With public pressure mounting, city officials were finally forced to act, opening up the case for a more thorough investigation into not just the officers involved in Marcus's arrest, but into the systemic issues that had allowed these kinds of incidents to persist. Abigail felt a surge of cautious hope as she read through the investigation's findings. The independent review uncovered a long history of racial profiling, discriminatory behavior, and excessive use of force by certain officers. There were names on the list, other instances where officers had crossed the line and were protected, their actions swept under the rug for far too long. Abigail couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication, but it also brought with it a deep anger. The truth was there, bare and ugly, but the question now was what would be done with it. The city's mayor, who had initially remained silent, was finally pushed into making a public statement. The pressure from citizens, the media, and local activists had become too great to ignore. At a press conference, the mayor promised swift action. "We will take immediate steps to address these findings. We will hold those responsible accountable," she said, her voice steady but lacking the confidence that usually accompanied political promises. Abigail stood in the back of the room, watching the mayor with a mixture of wariness and resolve. She had seen too many politicians speak without delivering on their promises. But this time, it felt different. The mayor knew that she was facing a citywide uprising, and she could no longer turn a blind eye. "We will reform," the mayor continued. "We are working with community leaders, including Judge Abigail Harper, to ensure that this kind of behavior is eradicated from our police force." Abigail's heart clenched slightly at the mention of her name, though she wasn't sure whether it was in recognition of her efforts or because it had become synonymous with the fight for justice. She stood up then, walking to the podium with purpose, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. "This is a victory for all of us who have been treated unjustly, for all of us who have had to endure the weight of prejudice," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "But it is just the beginning. We cannot afford to rest. We cannot allow this city's leaders to backpedal or become complacent. We need real change, not just promises. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Abigail knew that the real work was just starting. Behind closed doors, Abigail and Marcus discussed the next steps. They both knew that the fight for justice wasn't going to be solved overnight, and they couldn't expect the authorities to clean up their mess without constant vigilance. The officers involved in Marcus's arrest, as well as others named in the independent report, were still on paid administrative leave, awaiting disciplinary action. It was up to Abigail, Marcus, and their legal team to make sure they didn't slip through the cracks. One day, while going through the latest stack of legal documents, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. It was from the police chief, who had reached out personally to apologize. Marcus, the chief's voice sounded different this time, measured, almost regretful. "I want to personally apologize for the way you were treated that night. I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that we are taking immediate action within the department. The officers involved are being reassigned, and we are implementing new diversity training across the board. We need to do better." Marcus listened, his expression unreadable, as the chief continued to speak, outlining the department's planned reforms. It sounded good, too good, in fact. But Marcus had learned the hard way not to trust empty words. "I appreciate the apology, Chief," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "But an apology isn't enough. We need to see action. This isn't just about my incident. It's about changing the culture that allowed it to happen in the first place. And that's going to take more than some training seminars and a few reassigned officers." The chief sighed heavily. "You're right. I know that. And I'm willing to work with you and the community to ensure that real change happens. I won't let this go either." Marcus hung up, staring at the phone in his hand. "It's a start," he said quietly. "But we're not done yet." Abigail nodded, her jaw set in determination. "We can't stop now. Not until we see it through. Not until we know that this never happens to anyone else." The weeks following the mayor's speech were filled with mixed emotions for Abigail and Marcus. The public support continued to grow, with more and more people calling for police reform. But despite the positive momentum, there were still those who resisted change, those who felt that the justice system had already been hijacked and needed no further interference. Many of the officers who had been involved in questionable actions were defending themselves publicly, claiming that their actions had been misunderstood or that they had acted within their training protocols. It was a difficult battle, and one that was fraught with tension. The line between support and dissent had never been so stark, and the emotional toll was wearing on everyone involved. Abigail found herself staying up late, researching case after case of police misconduct, hoping that she could find some precedent or legal argument that would help them push forward. But there were days when it felt like the mountain they were climbing was too steep to scale. Still, they moved forward. Abigail and Marcus participated in town hall meetings, speaking directly to the community, answering tough questions, and confronting critics head-on. They made it clear that this wasn't about politics, it was about people. It was about the men and women who had been unjustly treated, who had suffered the indignities of being overlooked, stereotyped, or worse, brutalized. Their voices, though filled with passion and resolve, also carried a deep empathy. They spoke not just as a couple who had been wronged, but as advocates for a better world, one in which justice didn't depend on who you were or where you came from. They talked about their love for each other, how it had been tested in ways they hadn't anticipated, and how it had ultimately strengthened their bond. They spoke of the importance of community, of listening to one another, and of holding the powerful accountable. Through it all, Marcus never wavered. Despite the occasional threats, the online harassment, and the toll the fight was taking on both of them, he remained the steady rock Abigail had always known him to be. And Abigail, too, found strength in her own voice and her role as a judge, a symbol of the system that could be trusted to do right, but only if it was made to. And then, the breakthrough came. The internal investigation concluded, and a comprehensive set of reforms was announced by the police department. Among the actions were the immediate termination of the officers involved in Marcus's arrest, a full overhaul of the department's training programs, and the implementation of community oversight boards to ensure accountability moving forward. It wasn't everything Abigail and Marcus had hoped for. It didn't fix the broken system overnight, but it was a clear sign that change was happening. The officers involved in their case were no longer in positions of power, and the department was being forced to confront its history of abuse. For the first time in months, Abigail felt a sense of cautious relief. The battle had been long, and it was far from over, but it was clear that they were making progress. They had started a movement, and they had no intention of stopping now. A new beginning. The months that followed the announcement of the police department's reforms felt like a slow, painstaking climb, but with each step forward, Abigail and Marcus knew they were inching closer to a more just society. The city was still healing, still grappling with the fallout of what had happened at their wedding, but there was undeniable progress in the air, a feeling that change was possible, even if it took time. Abigail and Marcus had become symbols in the fight against systemic injustice. They were invited to speak at rallies, conferences, and schools, where they shared their story with anyone willing to listen. Their message was simple: real change wasn't just about confronting the wrongs in the system, but about taking proactive steps to build something better. A system where no one would be judged by their race, their background, or their circumstances, but by the content of their character. And while the journey ahead was far from simple, they were ready to continue the fight. Despite the overwhelming support, there were days when doubt crept in. Every victory, no matter how small, was met with opposition, sometimes from unexpected sources. The public backlash against police reform remained potent, especially from those who felt threatened by the changing dynamics. Some members of the community, both in law enforcement and the public, accused Abigail and Marcus of stoking division rather than fostering unity. Their critics called them troublemakers, even anti-police, a term that cut deeply, especially for Marcus, whose life had been dedicated to law enforcement. But Abigail knew the truth. This fight was never about vilifying police officers. It was about holding them accountable when they betrayed their responsibility. It was about making sure that every person, regardless of their skin color, could walk through the streets without the fear of being profiled, arrested, or treated like a criminal simply because of the way they looked. As the months passed, the changes within the police department began to materialize. The once stagnant bureaucracy had begun to shift under the weight of public scrutiny and internal pressure. New policies were introduced, and the department's training regimen was overhauled. Officers who had been involved in racial profiling were retrained, and an internal affairs division that had long been dormant was reinvigorated. The mayor, under the weight of continued public support and the push from activists, ensured that there would be real, measurable change. And when officers and members of the community complained about the new measures, the loudest voices in the room were the same people who had backed Abigail and Marcus from the very beginning. The community was divided, but the growing unity among those pushing for reform was powerful. Abigail had attended countless town halls, where she spoke of the need for police accountability and how deeply ingrained biases had led to so much suffering. She also began advocating for restorative justice programs, believing that true healing could only come when victims of police brutality and the officers involved in incidents like Marcus's were given an opportunity to engage in open dialogue. But while the public battle for justice continued, Abigail and Marcus also focused on their personal lives. The fight for change had taken a toll on their relationship, but it had also brought them closer. The pressure of public attention, the demands of their advocacy work, and the constant scrutiny they faced had tested their patience, but in each other, they found strength. They had faced the unimaginable together, and in doing so, had built a foundation of trust and mutual respect that could withstand anything. One evening, After a particularly difficult meeting where they had been faced with some of their harshest critics, Marcus turned to Abigail as they sat in their living room, the soft glow of the fireplace illuminating their tired faces. "I'm proud of us," he said quietly, taking her hand. "I'm proud of what we're doing. But more than that, I'm proud of the way we're doing it. We're not fighting hate with more hate. We're fighting it with love, with understanding." Abigail smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the warmth of Marcus's words. She squeezed his hand, grateful for his unwavering support. "We've come so far. And we're not stopping now. I know it's hard. Some days it feels like the weight of the world is on our shoulders. But we're making a difference. Every time we speak, every time we show up, we're making the world a little better. One step at a time." Marcus nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a sense of quiet determination. "And I'll be here, right beside you, every step of the way. No matter what." As summer rolled into fall, a significant moment arrived. The city council voted on a new set of police reform measures, which included stronger community oversight, mandatory bias training for all officers, and a renewed commitment to transparency within the department. It wasn't perfect, no reform ever was, but it was a step in the right direction. And for Abigail and Marcus, it felt like a personal victory. They had fought so hard, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been unjustly treated, for everyone who had been silenced by fear. The reforms passed with overwhelming support, though there were still detractors. The public debates over policing in their community had become more heated, more urgent. In some ways, the city was on the brink of a new chapter, one where its citizens could shape the direction of their future. And Abigail, who had spent her life fighting for justice, knew that this moment was critical. She had the opportunity to help write a new narrative, one that was inclusive and just for everyone. On the night of the council vote, Abigail and Marcus stood together outside the city hall, watching as the council members filed out after the historic vote. The cheers of the crowd rang in their ears, the voices of countless supporters who had rallied behind them. But even as the celebration echoed around them, Abigail couldn't ignore the pang of bittersweetness that came with knowing that this was only one small part of a much larger battle. "I can't believe it," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Abigail smiled softly, her gaze steady and full of resolve. "We did. But there's so much more to do." As the crowd around them began to disperse, they stood there for a moment, together, in quiet reflection. The city had taken a step toward justice, but they both knew the fight didn't end here. It would never end, not until true equality was achieved, not until every person could live their life without fear of being judged or profiled because of their skin color. The journey was far from over. And yet, for the first time in a long while, Abigail allowed herself to feel a quiet sense of peace. She had fought, and she had won. And even as they turned to walk home, she knew that no matter what lay ahead, she and Marcus would face it together, unwavering in their commitment to justice and love. Several weeks later, a small ceremony was held at the city's courthouse to honor Abigail and Marcus for their dedication to justice and community reform. It wasn't the kind of celebration they had once imagined for their wedding anniversary, but it was a testament to everything they had worked for. Their names were engraved on a plaque, displayed in the lobby of the courthouse, a reminder to everyone who entered that day that change was possible, and it was worth fighting for. Abigail stood next to Marcus, her hand tightly wrapped around his, and looked out at the crowd. They had fought for this moment. Fought through pain, through doubt, through the very systems that had oppressed them. And they had emerged victorious. It wasn't just a win for them, it was a win for everyone who had ever been denied justice. "I think," Abigail said softly, as they looked around at the smiling faces in the crowd, "we've changed the world. One step at a time." Marcus smiled, squeezing her hand in return. "No, Abigail. We've only just begun. The world's waiting for us to keep going." And with that, they turned together, walking into the future hand in hand, ready for the next chapter of their journey, a journey not of endings, but of beginnings.